Hello and welcome back. In this video we're going to be importing our Number Wizard code and turning our existing Number Wizard framework into an actual Number Wizard game, because right now it has no behavior. We can just move between scenes and that's not sufficient to make a game. So we're going to add some code from our previous Number Wizard game and we're going to add some win and lose conditions. So let's get started. So I'm here in my Unity editor. I'm on the game scene. I've got the game scene selected. There's currently nothing but the lose and win stuff and the level manager in there. What I want to do is I want to add my code from my previous game. So how do I do that? Well, let's take a look at our Finder. We've got the Finder right here, and that's your file browser, and I'm now browsing here in my previous Number Wizard game, and you have a scripts directory, and inside of there you have a Number Wizards with an S script in there. So what I want to do is I want to copy this script across into my new game. So I'm going to click and drag it into my new game in the project pane at the bottom. And you should see it come up in the assets, and I've now got a Number Wizards script with an S. So I'm going to change that S. It's annoying me a little bit, so I'm going to just change it right now. Take out the last S, and now it's called Number Wizard. Now I'm going to need to change the script, because if we take a look at the script right now, it's really the old code, and that's not going to be good enough for this game. We need to change it to reflect what we have now. Also, you'll notice that my Number Wizard script file is Number Wizard, and my class is Number Wizards with an S, and that cannot be done. You can't have the file name and the class being different, so I'm going to change the class to reflect the file name and save straight away. So cool, so this is our old code. And fundamentally what we want to do is change the keyboard input we have in the update right here. So whenever we press a up, down and return key, instead of doing that, we want to change that to button presses, which means we need to publicly expose some methods, we're going to be doing that now, to allow buttons to call the methods whenever they're clicked. So that's what we're going to do. And really the ones we're going to start with, we want the up, so guess higher, guess lower, are going to be our first two methods, and they're going to replace the up and down arrow keys. So let's get started. So firstly, these methods should be public, because they're going to be accessed outside of Number Wizard. So I'm going to have a public method. It's not going to return any value, so it's going to be void, and then it's going to be guess higher. So that means that's the equivalent of pressing the up arrow. So whenever this method is called, I want to do exactly the same thing I did before when I was pressing the up arrow, so I can just copy and paste this code right here. So I'm copying this code and moving it into my guess higher function. I really no longer need this get key down. I can get rid of that. I'm no longer driving my game using keys. Now feel free to keep it if you want, but if you're going to keep it, instead of having this code duplicated in two places, make sure that this is guess higher instead. So you're going to do guess higher. I cannot type today, so it's going to be guess higher instead, and you'll notice that that's actually equivalent code. There's no difference here except that we have packaged all the things we do whenever we guess higher into a method that we are calling. Now I'm just going to remove it because I don't need it, but feel free to keep it in your code for debugging if you want. So I'm going to do the same thing here. I'm going to take this out and move it into a new function called guess lower. Whenever we press the down arrow, that's kind of what we are talking about here. So I'm going to go void, and it's public void rather. So public void guess lower. Cool. So now I can put the code in, and that will do exactly the same thing as before, except now it's packaged in a tidy function instead. And I can remove that stuff too. Cool. And finally, it comes down to the case of what do we do when we win, when the player successfully, or rather the computer successfully picks a number. When the player actually, the computer finds a number that the player guessed, what happens then? Well, that will not be handled here. In fact, it'll be handled by pressing the correct button. So whenever we say correct, the button will then change the scene to the computer winning and the player losing. So that's what happens. So we don't need to handle it in the Number Wizard anymore, because we're going to be handling it with our scene flow instead. So we can remove this stuff completely, because it's not going to be handled there at all. That leaves our update function empty, and I don't like empty functions, so it's going away by update function. And finally, we want to remove this stuff we have that's in strings. We don't need to print stuff out to the console anymore because it's all going to be very visual, so we don't want to do that. So let's take those things out to start with, and that will leave the kind of the outline, the bare bones of our Number Wizard game. And what we'll need to do now is set up the win and lose conditions. So what are the win and lose conditions, and who's winning, who's losing? So there are two players in this game. There's the computer and there's the player, the human player. And so the human player wins if the computer cannot guess the number after a certain number of tries, and the computer player wins if he can guess the human number after in a certain number of tries. So we need the idea of a certain number of tries, and I'm going to call this integer max guesses. So int max guesses allowed, and I'm going to set that to 10 for now. I don't really, that's something you can tune, you can fine tune and pick yourself. I'm just going to say 10 guesses is the maximum that the computer is allowed to do. So how do we keep track of this? Well, whenever we create a new guess, the computer will have to reduce the number of guesses. So we can do max guesses allowed is max guesses allowed -1, right? So now we're reducing the guesses allowed every time, and we need to handle whenever they reach 0. So we do if max guesses allowed less than or equal to 0, so whenever they reach 0 basically, or get underneath, then we want to do something like, well, we want to jump to the win or the lose screen, right? Because that would be the win screen. The player has now picked a number that the computer has not been able to guess in 10 tries. So that would be the win screen. And to move between scenes, we can go application dot, and that's load level, not loaded level. Be careful, because those two functions can sometimes clash in the autocomplete. Load level, and we want to load the win screen, right? That's the player winning because he's picked a number the computer could not guess in 10 tries. And we save that, and that needs to be a capital letter. We need loaded level with a capital L at the beginning. Cool, so now we have a game that lets us pick numbers, and whenever we pick a number that the computer cannot guess in 10 tries, the human player wins, which is exactly what we want. And that's going to be the way we move from the game scene to our win screen. And the way we move from our game scene to our lose screen is going to be whenever we press correct, right? Whenever we say, yes, computer, you have found my number, well done. That's going to be whenever we move to the lose screen, and that's going to be handled by the button itself, not in the Number Wizard script. So cool, awesome, we have this Number Wizard script. That's great, we have a game. Now, how does it interact with the rest of the world? Let's jump back into Unity and look at our world. We have a script right here, but it's not even included in our scene right now. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a new empty object, and that's just going to be empty object, and we're going to call this guy Number Wizard. And that's to keep hold of our script that's going to be doing the functionality in there. So we click the Number Wizard script, and we're going to add it into our Number Wizard object in the inspector by clicking and dragging the script into the object on the inspector. Right, so now we have a script and it's attached to an object, so it's actually going to run, because if it's not attached to an object, it will not run. How do we get it to interact with the rest of the world? Well, right now we have nothing on our scene to interact with, so let's create something that the Number Wizard script can actually interact with. So I'm going to go into my canvas, select my canvas, go Game Object, UI, and add a text object. And now this text object is going to be my guess. That's the thing that the Number Wizard UI script is going to interact with. Notice I've just put it in UI mode. I've removed it from normal mode to UI mode using the buttons on the top left. And I'm going to change this text to be 500 as a placeholder number. That's going to be my initial guess. But that should be changed by the Number Wizard when we get to it. And I'm going to change some styles, make it white to pop out, and also increase the font size. Right? I want a big guess, right? Big guess. I think that's about right. Looks good to me. That will be good enough. So that's my guess. And let's make sure that the name of this object reflects what it is. We'll call it guess, press return. And now we have a guess in our scene. So how do we get the Number Wizard code to change the guess? Well, we've already done this. We did this in our very first text adventure game, the one we've done just before this. So the very first visual game we ever built, we got that going. So let's do that again. So we jump into our Number Wizard code, we jump at the top and we'll create a public variable that is the text itself. So public text. And you'll notice it doesn't come up in the autocomplete. If you look down here, and if I press space, it'll automatically complete it to something else. Now that's weird. Why is it doing that? Well, that's because there are no text objects or classes defined in my code right now. Right? Text doesn't exist, and that's because it doesn't belong to any of those namespaces. Right now we're importing two namespaces, Unity Engine and Systems.collection. For text, we'll need to import another one. So we do using Unity Engine.ui, and now our text will turn blue when we create it. So cool, so now we have a public text, and let's remember what that means. We have a text variable of type text, so capital T is the type of the variable, and text is the name. And I'm going to deliberately call it text because you need to be able to read this and understand which bits are which, depending on the context in which they are. So I'm going to name these things the same, and in fact it's going to be named the same as something else, just so to get you in the practice of understanding what these things mean based on how they're called and how they're invoked. So right now let's remind ourselves what we have. We have a variable of the NumberWizard class whose name is text, and type is text with a capital T. Cool, so that's the text we're going to be representing, and whenever we change the guess, whenever we do guess equals max plus min over 2, we're going to change the text itself. So that we can do by selecting our variable right here, so that's the variable in the NumberWizard class, and changing one of its attributes, right? The variable has attributes, and the attributes we're going to be changing is text. Whoa, that's confusing, right? Text.text of type text. Ooh, that's a bit weird. But this will actually take a string. So basically this represents the text itself that's stored in the object that you see on the screen with 500 on it, and that can be changed by changing the text attribute of that object. Now notice I could have called this guy anything. I could have called it foobar, right? If I called it foobar, then in that case I would have done foobar.text. So this I've got control of it, what this is called. This I don't. This is actually the attribute of the text type, and you can check what those things are by jumping to the documentation in your browser. So if you use a shortcut or just do a search in the documentation, you'll find this page here, and you have the text object. And if you click here, you'll find that you'll see where it's coming from as well. You'll see the namespace. The namespace will actually be highlighted, so it's showing you text comes from Unity Engine.ui, so you'll not be able to use text unless you use this namespace as well. And in this description, you'll find it has a variable called text, which is the string value this text will display. So by changing the text of the type text, you can change what's actually shown on screen. I hope that's not too confusing. It's kind of deliberate. Try and get your head around it. I'm going to remove foobar and pull it back to text. It's so you can understand the different context in which the variables are used. So this is the variable that's referenced within the NumberWizard class. This is an attribute of that variable, and this is the type of that variable. All right, so anyway, more to the point, we want to change this, what the text is displaying, to be the new guess, and we can do that by picking the guess and turning it into a string, and that's a method call on the guess itself. So we're going to do guess.toString. That's going to create a string with a number in it, and then we're going to set this string to be the text that we show on the screen. Oh, okay, I think that's pretty much all the most difficult bit of the code so far, so don't worry too much about it. And let's get to wiring this up in the scene itself. So now we have this public text variable. Let's jump into our scene. And we should be able to click on our NumberWizard and see that there is now a slot missing for our text right here. So now if I click on my guess and drag it into my text, now we will reference the guess itself, and we'll be changing the guess text. Cool. So what's missing now? Well, we're missing two things. Well, three things really, 3 buttons. We need 3 additional buttons for higher, lower, and correct. Now, correct is always going to be going to the lose screen. So I'm going to keep my lose button and simply change the text to correct. That's going to be my correct button. Now, win screen doesn't exist anymore. Oops, let's do it. Change the pivot, the pivot point. I don't want to do that. So this little round circle, I don't know whether you can see it, but the circle at the center of my object, if I select them in UI mode, you can see the circle, you can actually move it around. This is the pivot point. This is where the scaling occurs from, and I really want this to keep this in the middle. Just a little side notes to show you what I did wrong there. Okay, so back here, we don't want a win button. This is no longer a success button. I'm going to turn this into my guess higher button. So I'm going to name it guess higher. I'm going to say higher on the text. And instead of calling my level manager, I'm going to change the object it calls to be my number wizard. So drag and drop my number wizard. And instead of calling no functions, I'm going to call my number wizard guess higher function that takes no argument. Now that's pretty simple. We've got a higher button that calls number wizard or guess higher. We also want to duplicate this guy and create a guess lower button. That lowers the guess, right? Guess lower. And this guy is going to have the text lower. It's going to be below the correct object, the correct element in our UI. And I'm also going to be calling a different function. I'm going to call guess lower. Not send message. Let's get this right. Guess lower. Cool. So now if I press play, what happens? Let's take a look at what happens. If I press higher, I guess higher and 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 correct. Awesome. So now we have a game, right? We have a game that works and we've had to do almost nothing. So let's take another look and try it from the beginning. Let's jump into our start and see whether everything hangs together. So let's press play. So start. Let's say I pick the number 645. So 645, 645, and here we go, correct. And the computer tells me I was no match for his silicon brain, and no problem. Now let's go back and click to try me again, and this time I'm going to change the number of guesses allowed to just 5. I'm just going to go back in my code and change that to 5. And I'm also going to make this guy public so we can change it from within the inspector. We don't want to jump back in the code every time we want to change the difficulty of the game. That seems a little bit silly, so I'm going to make this public so we can change it in the inspector and put a default value of 5. Jump back in my game, and what I'm testing here, I want to know whether the computer can lose the game. So I'm going to press 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and the computer indeed does lose the game after a certain number of guesses. So cool, awesome. So we'll return to start, and now we have a game. So what's your task now? Well, let's take a look at our game scene. I think our game scene, if we take a look at the game preview, looks pretty dull and horrible. So your task is to spice it up. So spice up the game scene, and I will see you in another video with a spiced up game scene to finish and polish this Number Wizard game. So well done for getting this far, and I'll see you in another video. Bye for now.